So we're still on section 1.3, but we're finishing it up. Okay, it's kind of like we're continuing with midpoint. So far, what have they given you? They've given you two endpoints, and we have to find the midpoint, right? What they're going to do today is they're going to give you like this. I'll draw a little line right here. What they're going to do is they're not going to give you both endpoints. They're going to actually give you the midpoint. All right. I'll just put a number in here. I'll pick one. Okay. They'll give you a midpoint, and they're going to give you another endpoint. I'll tell you what. We'll do it right here. Okay. So they give you an endpoint, and they give you a midpoint. What did they give you before? The stuff you did last night. What did they give you? Two endpoints, right? They give you two endpoints. You had to find the midpoint. Do you see what they're doing today, though? They're giving you one endpoint and a midpoint. You got to find where that other endpoint is. And we don't know what it is. I'll just call it XY. Is that all right? Since we don't know what it is. That's what we're trying to find right there. Everybody with me so far on what we're trying to do? Okay, so they give you different stuff. They give you a midpoint, endpoint. We find the other endpoint. All right, what we're going to do is use that little formula for midpoint. We wrote it down a little earlier before we started recording, but let's write it down again. So here's the midpoint formula, just so we see the formula. All right, there it is. But let's see what they give us this time. We're not just going to plug in two numbers and divide by 2. Why not? Why can't I just put 5 and 4 in here and then divide that by 2? Because these represent what? The endpoints. Good. Okay, that represents the endpoint. Well, we'll do that in a second, and you're on to something. Okay, we will get to that in a second. But I'm going to kind of do this kind of like the long way, I guess, if you want to call it that. Let's just do this. Now look here's our little formula. What do we know so far in the formula? Give you a big hint. I'm circling it. We know the midpoint, don't we? So let's write that down. So what are we going to put for the midpoint? 5, 8. Good. So I'm going to put 5, 8. And that equals this stuff right here. So what do the x's represent? They represent the endpoints, don't they? The only problem is I don't know what this endpoint is, but I'll call it x. So how do I add up the endpoints? X plus what? Everybody paying attention? Come on, follow along. No, it's not x plus y. What are we doing right here? It's the two x's. So this is just x. I don't know what it is, right? And what's the other x? 4. So we're going to add x plus 4. See that? Because the midpoint formula says add the two x's together and divide by 2. Well, that's an x, right? The 4. And I don't know what that is, so I just call it x. And I have to divide it by 2 because that's what we do in our formula. What are we going to do the second part? Now you get the idea. What are we going to... Good. Y plus 3. Very good. So it's y plus 3 over 2. See how we set that up? It's not so hard, is it? We put what the midpoint is, because this time they tell us the midpoint. So we put that in there. And this, the x's represent the two endpoints. That's an x and a 4. We add them up, divide by 2. The y1 and y2 represent the endpoints, so it's going to be y plus 3 divided by 2. And now we're ready to solve for x and y. Well, let's think about this. Look at this x plus 4 over 2. They're equal to each other, right? This point is equal to this point. So what should this thing right here circled, what should that equal? It should equal 5. Very good. Everybody seeing that? It's in the same spot as that. See, this ordered pair equals this ordered pair. So the first thing here should equal the first thing here. You get that? Well, we'll do that in a second, okay? Let's just make sure we know what to set equal to each other. Let's take this. What's this going to equal then? It's going to equal 8. Good. So let's go ahead and write those down. So let's set this up. And we'll do a little bit of algebra. It's a little bit of writing, but it's not hard. The math is actually pretty easy. So x plus 4 over 2 equals 5. And then let's come over here. Let's do the blue one. We'll do it in blue. So it's going to be y plus 3 over 2. What's that equal? 8 right there. All right. Let's go back to this one. It's a plus right there. And let's solve for x. Now remember, when they gave you the two endpoints, we had to find the midpoint. What was our steps? We added and then we divided by 2, didn't we? This one, we're going to go completely the opposite. So instead of adding and then dividing by 2, we're going to go in the complete opposite direction, which is we're actually going to go even more backwards than that. So watch. Step 1 is add. Step 2 is divide by 2. We're going to reverse the steps and reverse the operations. So we're going to multiply by 2 and then what? Remember, it was, right, then minus. It was add and divide by 2. Now it's going to be what? Multiply by 2 and subtract. Okay? So I'll show you why. Watch right here. It's all because of this equation. How do I get rid of this 2 if it's being divided? No, I multiply. Do the opposite. Multiply by 2. Okay? So that's what we do. We multiply by 2 first. So I've got x plus 4 equals 10. Now what's my next step? Everybody can see this. Just subtract a 4, right? So look what happens. X equals what? 6. Let's come over here and do the same thing. Get rid of the 2. How do we get rid of the 2? Multiply by 2 and then multiply this by 2. So that cancels out. Y plus 3 equals 16. Subtract 3 from both sides. Y is 13. Okay, so how does that help us out? What are we trying to find? We're trying to find that other endpoint, aren't we? So what's our other endpoint? 6, 13. That's right. That's our other endpoint. So that's our answer right there. I'm going to circle the answer. So what did we really do? Let's look up here again. In order to find the endpoint, we took this midpoint, this 5, and what did we do to it? Right here. What did we do to it right here? Times it by 2. Okay, so we take, now listen, I'm showing you a quick, easy step. So you don't necessarily have to go through all this stuff right here every single time. I'm showing you a quick, easy, streamlined way to do this. Take this part right here of the midpoint. You take the midpoint, you multiply it by 2, and then you do what? What do we do here? We subtracted a 4, right? So you take the midpoint, you multiply it by 2, and then you subtract the 4. You're watching? You seeing that? So what's our step to find the endpoint? We multiply by 2, then we subtract that x number from it. Okay, so this times 2 is 10, subtract 4 from it, and it's 6. You don't necessarily have to set all this stuff up every single time. All right? Because of this algebra step right here. Remember, it's backwards. What if we were given the 2 endpoints, right? So what did you do? What was your first step? When they gave you the 2 endpoints, you had to find the midpoint. What did you do? You added, didn't you? So you added 2 numbers together. What was your second step to find the midpoint? You divided by what? By 2. Divide by 2. But this one, now that's if they give you the 2 endpoints, you got to find the midpoint. But what if they give you the midpoint and 1 endpoint? You got to go completely the opposite, don't you? So what's your first step? Instead of dividing by 2, we multiply by 2. And instead of adding, what do? We subtract. Do you see that? So you do this when you're trying to find the midpoint. But when they give you the midpoint and you're trying to find the endpoint, you do this. It's completely the opposite, right? Instead of add and divide by 2, what do? We multiply by 2 and subtract. Does that make any sense at all? So let's do a problem, okay? All that's just talk. Let's do an actual problem. And we'll kind of do it, it's really the same way. You know, people say, well, do it this way, do it that way. It's really the same way, but this is kind of like the streamlined way, okay? The way that's just a little bit quicker. There's not so much writing. All right, so here's a question they're going to give you. Let me write the question out. It says, find the coordinates of the missing endpoint. So it says find, I'll just shorten that a little bit, find the missing endpoint. So this is basically what the problem is going to tell you to do. Okay? And here's what they tell you. If E is the midpoint, so this is basically, I'll just shorten that, of DF. Now the problem that you're going to do looks very similar to this. Might use different letters and stuff, okay, but it's going to look really close to this. So we're going to find the missing endpoint if E is the midpoint of DF. Now watch what they do. They give you a couple points. In this problem, they give you F, which is 2, 9. And then they give you E, which is -1, 6. All right? So this is the problem right in front of you. This is the kind of stuff you're going to do. Find the missing endpoint if E is the midpoint. So look at this. Which one's the midpoint here? E, -1, 6. This one right here is the midpoint. Everybody see that? This is the other endpoint. Problem is, what are we trying to do? Find the missing endpoint. What's the missing endpoint? What letter is the missing endpoint? Right, if DF is our line segment, right? They tell you F. What are you trying to find then? Trying to find D. So watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to put D, and I'm going to put a little XY here, because that's what we're trying to find. We're trying to find this XY. It's not so hard so far, is it? They give you the midpoint. These are your two endpoints right here. So what are our steps to find the endpoint? What's the first step? Look on your notes. Did you write that down? I wrote it. It's up above there, but what do? We multiply by what? By 2. All right, so what do we multiply by 2? Let me get a different color here. The midpoint, okay? So we take that number right there, we take the midpoint, and we multiply it by 2. So let's do that. -1 times 2. What was our second step? Subtract, right? So number 2 was subtract. So let's go ahead and do that. So I multiplied this by 2, and then I got to subtract. What do you think I'm going to subtract from it? Look over here. This 2. You see it? So I take the midpoint, I multiply it by 2, and then I subtract the other endpoint from it. It's as easy as that. You just got to know which numbers to multiply and which numbers to subtract. That's the hardest part. Okay? So you take the midpoint, multiply it by 2, and then you subtract the other endpoint from it. Let's do that. That's -2 minus 2. What's -2 minus 2? No. Add a line, change the sign. Okay? You're adding them up, right? Same sign. So you add them up, it's 4. Same sign as negative. It's -4. -2 minus 2 is -4. So that's the x part of my midpoint. Let's do it one more time. But we'll do it with the y's this time. All right, so let's take the y. What do we do with that number? What's the... Multiply it by 2, and then what do we do with it? That's right. No, not by 2. We're doing the y's this time. Right, we're doing the y's. So you take the y, you multiply it by 2, and you subtract the other y from it. All right, so I subtract 9. See what I'm doing? I took the midpoint, I doubled the midpoint, and I subtracted the endpoint from it. Anybody hearing me? Okay. You take the midpoint, you double it, and you subtract the endpoint from it. So this would be what? 12 minus 9, and that is what? 3. So what's my final answer then? -4, 3. Good. It's an ordered pair, -4, 3. And that's how you do it. Okay? So again, let's do it one more time because I'm going to give you a problem to try here in a second. Take the midpoint. How do I know this is the midpoint? Because they tell me, right? Because it says E is the midpoint, right? So I know this is the midpoint, so I take the midpoint, the x part of the midpoint, and I double it, right? Multiply it by 2. And then I take away the other endpoint from it, right? Take away the 2. That's all there is to it. Take the 6, double it, take 9 away. That's all there is. So if they give you one endpoint and one midpoint, that's how you find the other endpoint. Think you can handle that? All right, let me give you a problem. It's the same thing. So again, I'll write it down. E is the midpoint of line segment DF. All right, so E is the midpoint of line segment DF. What are we trying to find? We're trying to find the other what? Endpoint. So they're going to give you one endpoint, and they're going to give you one midpoint. So let me write this down. This time they tell you what D is. They don't tell you F, they tell you D. That doesn't really make any difference, to tell you the truth. And they give you E, which is 1, -2. All right? So look, they give you one endpoint. Which one of these is the endpoint? What letter? The endpoint? D. D is the endpoint. E is the what? Midpoint. Okay, and what are we trying to find? What point are we trying to find? Right, we're trying to find F. So what do I call F? X, Y. All right, I'll leave the rest up to you. Give you about 30 seconds. Go. Find X and Y. All right, see what we did. We're trying to find this endpoint right here. Okay, so to find this other endpoint, what do? We take the midpoint. What's the first step? Times it by 2. All right, and then we take something away from it. What do we take away from it? Not a 3. It's -3. It's a big difference. Okay, so it's right. It's minus -3. That was the tricky part about this. A lot of people look at, oh, it's just -3. No, it's minus -3, which is plus, just like you said. So that's 2. That's a plus 3. And so that's a 5. But that's only half of our answer, isn't it? We have to do the y now. So let's do the y. So I take the y of the midpoint. Don't take the endpoint. Take the midpoint and multiply it by 2. All right? So take the y, multiply it by 2, and then do what to that? Minus -8. Right, minus -8. All right, so you take the midpoint, you double it, and you take away that x part from it. Take the y of the midpoint, double it, and take the y part away from that. All right, so that's -4. What's minus a negative? Positive, so that's a +8. What's -4 plus 8? It's 4. It's +4. Okay? If you're not sure of your addition with negatives and all that, you're going to have to get that straight. That was Algebra 1. Okay, you got to come into here knowing how to do those. So you need to review that if that's a problem for you. And there's basically our answer, but we write it nice and neat. We write it as an ordered pair, 5, 4, and that would be your answer. So that's the other endpoint. Do you know what they're doing now? They give you one endpoint, they give you a midpoint. Guess what we just found? The other what? Endpoint. All right? So now you got 2 endpoints and a midpoint. We just found the endpoint. That's the kind of stuff you're going to be doing. So take a look at your worksheet. It's worksheet. It's the same worksheet you've been working on. It's page 20, right? Yeah, it's section 1-3, worksheet 1-3. And now we're going to do the last 3 problems, so 19 to 21. And you've got time in here to start working on it, okay? So this is what I want you to finish up, 19 to 21. You should be able to finish it before class is over, and then you'll be done. And then you won't have homework tonight. All right? For those going on the football trip, I've got a worksheet for you that we're going to do tomorrow, so I'll give that to you now.